Contextual editing gives you real-time feedback on the page that you're editing. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can go from CMS to contextual editing in under 30 minutes. So if you're ready to learn how to use contextual editing with TinaCMS, stick around as we dig into some code. This project begins with us creating a new application. So we can do npx create next app -- example. And then we just need to tell it what example we want to use. So we're going to use CMS-Tina, which is our Tina CMS. And then we just need to give it a name. So we can call this contextual editing. And that's going to go ahead and get the example and use that. Once it's installed everything, we can go into Visual Studio Code and talk about how it currently works and what we're going to do to improve it. So here we are in our application. And let's talk about all the pieces that Tina is currently doing, and then we can talk about what we're going to do to improve this. So currently we have this .tina folder. Inside of it, it has a generated and a components and a schema. The schema tells us the shape of the content. So in here, you can see we have blog posts, and you can find all of the blog posts here _posts. So we look at that. Here is our Markdown files, and inside of that is the Markdown content that was provided by Next.js. Now, inside of here, you'll see title, excerpt, cover image, date, author, and OG image. Now, those are all part of our schema here. Title, excerpt, cover image, date, object, that is an author, object that is OG image, and then the actual body of the content. Then underneath that, we have our Tina configuration. Here is where we define things such as the API URL, which in development mode will be localhost 4001. And then when you deploy this to production, it goes here, which is just the Tina client ID, and we handle the rest from our URL. Then in here, we have the CMS callback, and currently the only things that are installed are route mapping, which is a plugin that tells the CMS where to send you if you click on a post. We won't be handling this in this video, but an upcoming video, you'll be able to set this up on your application and get going. So now we've talked about this, let's just quickly talk about these components. We have this Tina provider that just allows you to use TinaCMS. And then we have the dynamic provider, which allows you to essentially wrap your application in a dynamic provider that only switches on when it's in edit mode. When you go to the app.js here, you'll see that we're wrapped in Tina and it's this dynamic provider. So this allows you to keep a tiny bundle size and only launch Tina when you're in edit mode or the admin mode or however you want to call it. It's when you're logged into the application. Then for the admin, we just have this Tina admin that essentially is a component that we've created that handles the admin of Tina. So we've talked about that. Let's launch this application so you can see what it is in case you've never seen Tina before. So we can do yarn Tina dev. And this will launch the GraphQL layer and the application itself. Now that's launched, we can go to localhost 3000 and take a look at what we see. So here is the blog. You can see it looks pretty normal, nothing out of the ordinary, and this is powered by Tina. If you go to /admin and hit enter, you'll get a screen that asks you if you want to edit with Tina. When you click this button, we're going to redirect you back to this screen. Now, this is the CMS. I did a previous video, which I'll drop in a card at the top right-hand corner. This is our CMS. So you can go here and we can click this dynamic routing and we can start editing our content on screen, hit save, and that will get passed down to the Markdown files. So that covers what it currently looks out. So we're going to go ahead and log out and go back to the site. Now let's start talking about what we're going to do to improve this. So the code right now just essentially handles editing these Markdown files and doesn't require us to do anything. But with contextual editing, there are a few moving pieces. We need to know where this content is coming from, where we need to edit it from, and we need to use that GraphQL layer to do that. So inside of this slug.js is where we're going to be doing all of our work. Right now, how this data is being loaded is it's using getStaticPaths and getStaticProps, and it's passing in content. This content is then getting generated at build time in theory, although when you're using the dev, it will get updated automatically. But what we want to do is power this page with contextual editing. Contextual editing is a real-time experience. So as you're typing on the screen on the left-hand side, what you see on the right-hand side is how it's going to look. So we need to do a few things. We need to tackle how to make GraphQL queries. We need to use those GraphQL queries down here instead of what's happening right now. And then we need to update this code to actually use Tina and allow contextual editing. So the first thing we really want to do is tackle our getStaticPaths. getStaticPaths allows you to dynamically load in content that's going to be built. So for every post that's in here, the page will get built based upon this query. So we need to update this query to use our GraphQL. Now we have a GraphQL client that you can reach at localhost 4001/ALTAIR. And I'll show that right now. So here is our GraphQL client. This allows you to use localhost 4001 and make queries based upon that. And we're going to create our first query in here so that we can understand how it all works together. So first we need to write the query. So you can write the word query, and then inside of that query is where we're actually going to do the work. So it has IntelliSense. So if you type the word like get, it will give you a bunch of different options to choose from. We actually want this get post list, so we can select that. And then we need to tell it what we actually need returned back from the client. So we're going to need the edges, and then we're going to need the node. And then inside of that node, we're going to need to access the file system. So that will be sys. And then we need the file name. So we can type the word file and file name will show up. Now, if you run this query, you'll see here what's getting returned is get post list, and the edges are each one of these different file names. So we have edge number 1 here is this object. It has a node, sys, file name, and dynamic routing. So we're going to need that. And you can take this query now and copy it. And we're going to drop that into our Visual Studio Code. So our getStaticPaths right now just takes in get posts and uses this get all post lists from Next.js. So what we're going to do is update this to use our GraphQL query, and then we can return based upon that. So go ahead and clear all of the content out, and we'll rewrite this content. First thing we need to do is use something called static request. So at the top of our application, underneath everything else, we're going to keep all of the Tina stuff that we add at the bottom here so you can follow along and it doesn't get lost in the content at the top. So we're going to do import static request from TinaCMS, and then just make sure we wrap this in a set of curly braces. And now we can use this static request. Now this static request is just a helper to help you create these requests. And you don't have to use it. You could use fetch or something like that. But the Tina powered one is really useful. So now we can do const post list data equals await static request. And then inside of our static request is where we get to do our query. So we can write the word query and a colon. And then inside a set of backticks, we can paste in our query that we just wrote. And just for posterity, we'll add in a tab here, just so that it's easy to follow and understand. And then we can put a comma here, close this out, and now we have this functionality. Then we just need to do our return. So for our return here, we're going to do paths, and we're going to do post. So this list of data, so we can copy this and drop that here, dot get posts list dot edges dot map. And before we go on, if you go back to the GraphQL query here, we're going basically based upon this. So we're inside of here right now, and then we're going through these edges. So we're mapping over these edges. We're going to access the data inside of each of these objects. So now we're inside the edge. We can do edge. And then inside of here is where we're going to set params. and we're going to set it to a slug. And we're going to do edge.node.sys.filename, which matches the object, right? So we're inside of, this is an object. Then we want the node sys file name, which will be the file name based upon this query. We can put a comma here, and then we'll just put fallback false and hit save. Then, because we've done that, we can actually remove the get all post because we're not using this anymore. If you look through and we hit find here, it's only here. So let's remove this and hit save. Now, if we go back to our application, nothing should have changed from a visual standpoint, but now we're powering it with the Tina GraphQL versus accessing it through the API that Next.js created, which is just basically accessing the file system. So I've launched the application. As you can see, we are inside of a post right now and nothing has changed. It looks exactly the same as before. But you know behind the scenes that we're launching this using this getStaticRequest and passing down the information from the GraphQL layer to this params and using the file name to power it. So now we need to fix this part, the getStaticProps. Although it could work right now, the problem is contextual editing won't work. So we need to update this to use our GraphQL layer. But there's a bit more involved here. Because of the way that Tina works, in the future part of this, we're going to be using something called useTinaHook. So instead of writing our query inside of here, we're actually going to include the query at the top so that we can access it anywhere within the application page. So the way this query is going to work is essentially we're going to use a single request. We're going to pass down the relative path, which is the file name, because this is what's powering Tina. We're going to use that and we're going to request all of these different pieces of information that comes from the front matter, which is also included in the schema right here. We're going to ask for all that information so we can power the same pages. So let's go back to our client for our GraphQL layer and let's start writing this query. So here we are. Here's the old query that we used to request the data from our GraphQL layer. And we're going to make a different query now. So we've cleared everything out. We can now write the word query and we'll call this blog post query. And we're going to pass in a relative path. So we can type the word $ and then relative path. And then that's going to be a string and it's going to be required, which is what this exclamation point does. Then inside of that, we're going to write our actual query. So let's first fix this. It should look like this with a close and open parentheses. Then we're going to do get posts document. And then inside of that, we're going to pass in this relative path. And we're going to do $ relative path. And then inside of here is where we're going to request the data. So we can write the word data. And then inside of the data, if you do any IntelliSense, if you hit the word T for title, it will show up. And then we need the excerpt, we need the date, we need the cover image, we need the author, but the author is going to be slightly different because it's an object. Technically, it has two pieces of information. We can do author like this, and then we can hit N for name, and then picture. And then underneath the author, we need another object, and that's going to be our OG image, which is going to hold our URL. And then finally, the final piece to the data is the body of text that is contained within it. So this is our query, and just to show off how it works, I can show you down here by adding a variable in. We can open a set of curly braces, and inside of here, we can type the word relative path, and then we can give it a relative path. So one of the queries is named dynamic routing.md, and this should return the data here. And here you go. Here is all the data. So each one of these is the front matter, and this final one is the body of text. So now we have everything. We can use this query to power our whole application, including contextual editing. So copy this query and go back to your Visual Studio Code. And inside of our slug here, we're going to create a new const at the top. We'll call const query equals a set of backticks and then paste in this query. Now this query is ready to be used anywhere on this page. So the next section we need to do is to update our static props. So we're going to update that by essentially deleting everything out here. We don't need any of this. And we're going to create our new query. So we're going to do const slug, and we're going to destructure that from the params. So equals params. And remember, that's what we're sending down here. So we have access to the file name. Then we're going to create a variable here. So variables equals relative path. So relative path, and then slug and then after it .md. Then we need our data, and our data is going to be our request. So we can do data equals await static request, which remember is our Tina powered requester. Then inside of that, we can just do query, and then variables. And that's going to pass in these variables here into it, and the query is going to come from the top. Then we need to do our return functionality here. So we can do return, and then we're going to do props, data, comma, variables. Now, it might seem weird that we're returning what we're actually requesting, but we're going to use this to power the contextual editing. So we're going to return everything that comes back from the query and also the variables. Now, if we hit save now, if we go back to our application and hit enter, it's going to break because we have to update a bunch of stuff. It says can't resolve FS, import trace requested, and then it's going to say 404 not found. So we need to update some more code. So now we have this all set up, we should work on the next section. So now we need to actually update our sort of UI section to one, both be handled from Tina and also be able to be edited by Tina, and two, update all of this information. So first, let's work on our Tina variables. So we're going to use something called the use Tina hook. So I'm going to import that. So it's import use Tina. That's going to be from TinaCMS /dist/edit-state. And that's going to allow us to essentially power the page both in production and also when you want to edit it. So now we can start working on this actual UI section. So the first thing we want to do is just remove out all of this, and we're going to use just props passed in. Then underneath that, we're going to create something called const data is going to equal use Tina. So we're going to use that Tina hook. And that use Tina hook is going to have the query, which is being filed in from the top here, the data, and the variables. So we can write the word variables here, and we can do props.variables. And then underneath that, data, and that's going to be props.data. Now we have access to do all sorts of stuff with this. Essentially, we're powering the page with these variables, and we're also powering the page with data. Now, data allows us to essentially say, hey, if we're not editing this page, just pass the data along, and no one is any wiser. But when you're editing in Tina, what it's doing is updating based upon this query and variables so that we know which page to update. So now we've done that, we need to actually start working on the sections down here. So the first thing we need to do is change the way that this works. So right now it's looking for .slug, but what we can do is do props.variables.relative path. And remember, the relative path is the string that we need. So it'll be one of these file system, either dynamic routing, hello world, or preview. And if it doesn't exist, then, well, we need to error out. Next, we can update this preview and just going to set it to false. We're not using previews here, so we can set this to false. And then we can start working on the rest. So as you scroll down, you'll notice that this says .title, post.title. So we're going to change this from post.title to data.getPostDocument.data.title. And that will be powered by Tina. So we can actually copy this and use this everywhere where post dot is. So we can do dot for the title, for the OG image, for the cover image, for the date, and even for the content here. So we'll do dot content will be dot body. And now this page is being powered by Tina. So if we hit save here, we should be able to launch our application and see that it looks exactly the same. But before we test this out, we need to delete some functionality from here that we're not using anymore. So we're not using this get post slug, so we can get rid of that and hit save. And now we should be able to see the application as is. Here it is. Dynamic routing, it looks exactly the same, except from this section looks a bit strange, but we can now edit this if we so wish. So if we go to /admin and log in, we're on this page right now, and because we're not using the route mapping plugin, it goes to this page. But if we just go ahead and go to localhost 3000 /post/dynamic routing, what we should see is the ability to edit this page right here. As you can see, we have this sidebar, which is resizable now, and we can actually see what we change on the screen. So we say Tina is awesome. And if we scroll down, we can edit here, if we so wish, the content that's inside. The problem with the content inside right now is we're not actually using Markdown. We're just passing in a string. So we need to fix this so that this looks correct when we edit, because if I do, you know, two for a title and type title, you can see it's just a string. So let's go ahead and fix this now. So there are multiple ways we could do this. Firstly, we could use the Tina Markdown powered MDX editor to take care of this for us. Or we could essentially pass in the string and convert it into Markdown. Now, conveniently for this example, they've already done this for us with Markdown to HTML, which does this for us. So instead of using the Tina Markdown MDX powered rich text editor, we're going to just use this Markdown to HTML to take care of it so that you can understand there are multiple ways to do this using Tina. So for this to work, we're going to need use effects. So we can import use effect from React and just make sure that's in a set of braces. Now we can use this wherever we need to. So underneath our Tina data here is where we're going to do it. We're going to do use effect, and we're going to do equals, and then inside our function, all we're going to do is say const pass markdown equals an asynchronous function. And inside that function, we're going to set the content, which means we need to use another React feature here. So we're going to set content, comma, set content equal to useState. And we'll set this to an empty string, and then we'll make sure we import this as well. So back to here, useState, hit save. We can set the content here to await markdown to HTML, and then do data dot get posts document dot data dot body, and then we can just do pass markdown and run that function. And then what stops this function, or what is tied to the function, is going to be data dot get posts document data.body. So we can just copy this and drop it in here. So every time this updates, this use effect will run and update the content. Then all we need to do is set our body of content. Instead of being before, which was data.body, we can actually just set the content to whatever we need it to be. So down here, we can change this to content equals content. And the last thing we need to do is make sure that our use effect is all asynchronous. So let's just check here. Now, if we go back to our application and look now, if we do a quick refresh and we just minimize this bar for now, you'll notice that this has now gone back to the way it was. We now have actual proper Markdown support. And as we type, so if we do an H2 here and do testing, you can see that this is being passed in. So there you have it. Contextual editing using TinaCMS. Now, if you did enjoy this video, make sure to drop it a like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as we'll be dropping more information about how to use Tina, projects, and even example code so that you can get the best experience from us.